Behind the groundbreaking special effects and iconic one-liners of Terminator 2 lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets that would make even a time-traveling cyborg do a double-take. From punk rockers who almost became liquid metal assassins to condoms used for otherworldly sound effects, the making of this sci-fi masterpiece was filled with unexpected twists, dangerous stunts, and studio executives who nearly destroyed one of cinema's greatest sequels. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Terminator 2. Judgment Day, 1991. Fact 1. Billy Idol's motorcycle crash changed film history. When James Cameron was casting the villain for Terminator 2, Judgment Day, he had his sights set on someone who could bring a cold, menacing presence to the shape-shifting T-1000 robot. His first choice wasn't an unknown actor or a traditional Hollywood star, but rather punk rock legend Billy Idol, whose bleached hair and piercing stare seemed perfect for the role of an emotionless killing machine from the future. Cameron and his effects team at Stan Winston's studio were so committed to this casting choice that they actually created concept art and drawings featuring Idol as the T-1000. According to Robert Patrick, who eventually landed the role, he saw Billy Idol's image displayed at Stan Winston's workshop when he arrived for his own audition. The storyboards looked exactly like the punk rocker, and Cameron had told his stunt coordinator Joel Kramer that Idol was indeed his first pick for the demanding part. However, fate intervened in a dramatic way on February 6, 1990. Billy Idol was riding his Harley-Davidson motorcycle through the streets of Hollywood when he ran a stop sign at an intersection and collided with a car. The accident was devastating. Idol wasn't wearing a helmet, and the impact shattered his right leg between the knee and ankle while also fracturing his forearm. He was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where doctors worked for 7 hours trying to save his leg. At one point, medical professionals feared they might have to amputate the limb entirely. The injury left Idol with a severe limp and a metal rod permanently installed in his leg. While he was grateful to keep the limb and eventually recovered enough to continue his music career, the physical demands of playing the T-1000 were now impossible. The role required extensive running sequences, including the famous scene where the T-1000 chases John Connor's motorcycle on foot. Cameron realized that Idol simply wouldn't be able to handle the intense physical requirements that the character demanded. With Idol out of the picture, Cameron's casting team began searching for a replacement. They eventually found Robert Patrick, whose agent cleverly marketed him as a cross between David Bowie and James Dean. Patrick brought his own interpretation to the role, training extensively to run at high speeds while breathing only through his nose to create an inhuman, machine-like presence that became iconic in cinema history. Fact 2. Edward Furlong aged visibly during filming. When 13-year-old Edward Furlong was cast as John Connor in Terminator 2, director James Cameron had no idea that the extended production schedule would create one of the most unusual challenges in Hollywood history. The filming of Terminator 2 lasted approximately 8 months, from October 1990 through March 1991, which might seem like a normal time frame for a big-budget movie, but for a teenage actor going through puberty, it became a logistical nightmare. Furlong was discovered at a Boys and Girls Club in Pasadena by casting director Molly Finn, and he had never acted before in his life. When production began, he was a small 13-year-old boy who looked appropriately young to play the future leader of the human resistance as a child. However, as the months of filming dragged on, Furlong's body began changing in ways that the production team couldn't control or predict. The most noticeable change was his height. At the beginning of shooting, Furlong was several inches shorter than his stunt double, but by the end of production, he had grown so much that he was actually taller than the person who was supposed to match his size. This created serious continuity problems, especially in scenes that were filmed months apart but were supposed to take place within hours or days of each other in the movie's timeline. To solve this height problem, the crew came up with a creative but somewhat ridiculous solution. In some of the final scenes they shot, particularly during the climactic sequences in the steel mill, they literally dug holes in the ground for Furlong to stand in so that he would appear the same height as Linda Hamilton and maintain consistency with his earlier scenes. Even more challenging was Furlong's voice, which began cracking and deepening as his vocal cords matured during filming. James Cameron and the sound team could hear the difference between his early recordings and his later dialogue, which created a serious problem since John Connor's voice couldn't randomly change pitch in the middle of the movie. The solution required Furlong to return to the studio after principal photography wrapped to re-record approximately half of his lines in post-production, with sound engineers working to match the pitch and tone of his earlier higher voice. Cameron deliberately left one scene unchanged, where John explains to the Terminator why humans cry, because he felt Furlong's slightly deeper voice actually added emotional weight to that particular moment. Fact 3. Condoms created the T-1000's transformation sounds. One of the most memorable aspects of the T-1000 in Terminator 2 is the eerie, otherworldly sound it makes when transforming from one shape to another, but the method used to create these iconic audio effects involved some surprisingly unconventional materials. Sound designer Gary Rydstrom, who worked for Skywalker Sound, was tasked with creating audio that would make the liquid metal Terminator sound both mechanical and organic at the same time. James Cameron had a very specific vision for how the T-1000's transformations should sound. He wanted something that felt hyper-realistic, as if every sound effect in the movie had been injected with extra intensity and power. The challenge was creating audio that would suggest a being made of liquid metal, while also conveying the unsettling nature of something that could change its shape at will. Rydstrom's solution involved a bizarre combination of household items and creative recording techniques. He started by mixing flour and water together to create a thick, gooey substance that could simulate the consistency of liquid metal. Then he took a standard microphone and carefully wrapped it in a condom to waterproof it, allowing him to submerge the recording equipment directly into the mixture without damaging the sensitive electronics. The key ingredient in this strange recipe was dust-off, the compressed air product commonly used to clean computer keyboards. Rydstrom would spray the dust off directly into the flour and water mixture while the protected microphone recorded from within the goop. The compressed air created large, slowly forming bubbles in the thick liquid, and as these bubbles expanded and moved through the mixture, they produced a sound that was remarkably similar to a cappuccino machine or milk steamer. What made this technique so effective was the evolving quality of the sound. As Rydstrom explained in interviews, the moment when a bubble was forming had a distinctly metallic quality to it, but it also had a clear beginning and end, which perfectly matched the visual of the T-1000, starting a transformation, changing shape, and then completing the process. The slowly forming bubbles gave the transformations an organic, almost breathing quality that made the liquid metal seem alive, rather than simply mechanical. This incredibly simple and inexpensive method became one of the most recognizable sound effects in science fiction cinema, proving that sometimes the most memorable movie magic comes from the most unexpected combinations of everyday materials. Fact 4. Linda Hamilton's real twin played her double. When James Cameron needed to show two Sarah Connors on screen at the same time during the climactic scenes of Terminator 2, he faced a technical challenge that many filmmakers would solve using expensive split-screen effects or complicated camera tricks. Instead, Cameron discovered he had access to the perfect solution right within Linda Hamilton's own family, since the actress had an identical twin sister named Leslie Hamilton Guerin, who could step in as her exact double. The most prominent use of Leslie as Linda's double occurs during the steel mill finale, when the T-1000 takes on Sarah Connor's appearance to try to fool John Connor and the Terminator. In these crucial scenes, audiences see what appears to be two identical Sarah Connors facing each other, but they're actually watching both Hamilton sisters performing together on the same set at the same time. The production team developed a specific system for deciding which sister would play which version of Sarah Connor in any given shot. Leslie would typically play whichever Sarah Connor was positioned furthest from the camera, since this allowed Linda Hamilton to handle the more prominent, close-up acting moments that required the most dramatic intensity. However, in some shots, the roles were reversed, with Linda Hamilton actually playing the T-1000 version of Sarah, while Leslie portrayed the real character. This twin-swapping technique wasn't limited to the final confrontation scenes. Leslie Hamilton Guerin also appeared in a deleted scene that was later restored in the special edition version of the movie. In this sequence, Sarah Connor performs maintenance on the damaged Terminator, and the scene required showing Sarah's reflection in a mirror while she worked on the cyborg's head. Rather than using complex mirror effects or digital trickery, the filmmakers simply had Leslie stand where the mirror reflection would be, perfectly mimicking Linda's movements from the opposite side. The use of identical twins was actually part of a broader pattern in Terminator 2's practical effects approach. The production team also employed twin brothers Don and Dan Stanton to play the hospital security guard and his T-1000 duplicate in the psychiatric hospital scenes. This old-fashioned technique of using real twins instead of expensive special effects allowed Cameron to achieve seamless double appearances while keeping costs down and maintaining the realistic look that made the movie's practical effects so convincing. Fact 5. A random woman interrupted Arnold's nude scene. One of the most memorable opening sequences in Terminator 2 shows the T-800 Terminator arriving from the future in a dramatic ball of lightning and fire, then walking completely naked into a biker bar to acquire clothing and transportation. However, the filming of this iconic scene led to one of the most amusing unscripted moments in the movie's production history, when an unsuspecting member of the public accidentally wandered into the middle of a major Hollywood shoot. The biker bar scene was filmed at a real establishment called The Corral, and the production team had rented the location for several days to capture all the necessary footage. The sequence required Arnold Schwarzenegger to appear nude as the Terminator, since the time travel process in the movie's mythology doesn't allow clothes or other non-living materials to be transported through time. However, during breaks in filming, Schwarzenegger would naturally put on some clothing to stay comfortable between takes. On one particular day during the shoot, a woman who was completely unaware that a movie was being filmed walked into the bar, apparently thinking it was open for regular business. Instead of finding the usual bartender and customers, she encountered the world's most famous action star standing around in a pair of bright purple Bermuda shorts, surrounded by film equipment, cameras, and crew members preparing for the next shot. Rather than explaining the complicated situation about filming a science fiction movie or trying to have security escort the confused woman away, Schwarzenegger decided to handle the situation with his characteristic sense of humor. Without missing a beat, he looked at the bewildered woman and calmly told her that it was male stripper night at the bar, as if this explained why he was standing around in shorts while surrounded by all the unusual activity. The woman, presumably even more confused by this explanation than she had been by the original scene, quickly made her exit from the establishment. The incident became one of the favorite behind-the-scenes stories shared by the cast and crew, and it perfectly captured Schwarzenegger's ability to think quickly and maintain his composure even in the most unexpected situations. Interestingly, this same location was being used for filming during a historically significant time, as the production was taking place near the area where the Rodney King incident occurred, and James Cameron later realized that some of their footage actually captured parts of that tragic event in the background. Fact 6. The nuclear scene used a miniature Los Angeles. One of the most haunting and memorable sequences in Terminator 2 is Sarah Connor's nightmare vision of nuclear destruction sweeping across Los Angeles, and the terrifying realism of this scene comes from an incredibly detailed miniature city that was built specifically to be destroyed on camera. James Cameron wanted this nuclear blast sequence to be as extreme and realistic as possible, describing it as a godlike dissection of the city, and he knew that computer graphics technology in 1990 wasn't advanced enough to create the level of destruction he envisioned. The solution came from a special effects company called Forward Productions, where model makers Robert and Dennis Skotak took on the massive task of constructing an entire-scale replica of downtown Los Angeles. This wasn't just a simple backdrop or a few recognizable buildings, but rather an intricate miniature city that included detailed roadways, tiny vehicles, palm trees, and accurate representations of actual Los Angeles landmarks and street layouts. The level of detail in this miniature city was extraordinary, with the Skotak brothers paying careful attention to making sure the scale model would react realistically when subjected to the forces that would simulate a nuclear blast. The tiny cars and buses were specially designed to break apart and fly through the air convincingly, with parts that were deliberately scored or built with breakable materials, so they would crumple and bend the way real vehicles would during such a catastrophe. To create the actual destruction, the effects team used a combination of air cannons and carefully engineered pulley systems. Steve Bryan and Rick Ruskowski designed motor-driven pulleys that moved the miniature traffic through invisible slots in the roadway, with little hooks attached to the undersides of the vehicles. When the simulated blast wave hit, strategically positioned air cannons would blow the cars, buses, and other debris off the roads and into the air, creating the devastating scene of urban destruction. The palm trees presented a particular challenge because they didn't have enough surface area to be blown over naturally by the air cannons, so the effects team had to rig them with hidden wire pulls to make them topple convincingly. The entire sequence was filmed at 60 frames per second and required 8 separate takes to achieve the perfect shot. with extensive rebuilding and resetting of the miniature city required between each attempt. The final result was so realistic that nuclear scientists later wrote to James Cameron, praising the sequence as one of the most accurate depictions of nuclear destruction ever captured on film. Fact 7. Linda Hamilton knocked out a co-star for real. During the filming of Terminator 2's intense psychiatric hospital escape sequence, Linda Hamilton found herself in an increasingly frustrating situation with actor Ken Gibbel, who played Douglas, one of the orderlies responsible for forcibly medicating her character, Sarah Connor. The scene required Gibbel to strike Hamilton with a nightstick as part of the violent confrontation, but his reluctance to actually hit a woman created serious problems for the production. Ken Gibbel had landed what seemed like a dream role in one of the biggest movies of 1991, but when it came time to film the brutal scene where his character beats Sarah Connor, he couldn't bring himself to strike Hamilton with the necessary force to make the action look convincing on camera. Despite multiple takes and direction from James Cameron, Gibbel repeatedly pulled back at the last moment, making his attacks look fake and unconvincing. This timid approach created a cascade of problems that went far beyond just poor-looking action sequences. Because Gibbel wasn't hitting her properly, the scene had to be shot over and over again, which meant that Hamilton was forced to fall repeatedly onto the hard hospital floor during each failed take. The constant reshooting left Hamilton with bruised and battered knees from hitting the unforgiving surface multiple times, and her frustration with Gibbel's inability to commit to the scene grew with each painful repetition. Hamilton's anger reached a boiling point during a later scene in the same sequence, where Sarah Connor fights back against her captors during the escape attempt. In this scene, Hamilton's character grabs a broken broom handle and uses it as a weapon against the orderlies. When the cameras rolled and Hamilton had the opportunity to strike back at Gibbel's character, she didn't hold back the way he had been doing to her. Hamilton swung the broom handle with full force and actually knocked Ken Gibbel unconscious on camera. The blow was completely real, and Gibbel was genuinely stunned by the impact. While this created a brief delay in filming as the actor recovered from the unexpected assault, Hamilton later admitted that she had deliberately used the scene as an opportunity to get revenge for all the times Gibbel had failed to hit her properly, forcing her to endure multiple painful takes on the hard floor. The incident became legendary among the cast and crew as an example of Hamilton's total commitment to making the action sequences as realistic and intense as possible. Fact 8. The film's rights were bought for just $5 million. The creation of Terminator 2. Judgment Day was almost prevented entirely by a complex legal battle over film rights that had nothing to do with creative differences and everything to do with corporate ownership disputes. When James Cameron wanted to make a sequel to his 1984 hit The Terminator, he discovered that he couldn't simply write a script and start filming because the rights to the Terminator franchise were split between two different companies that couldn't agree on moving forward. The original Terminator movie had been financed and produced through a partnership that gave Hemdale Film Corporation a 50% ownership stake in the franchise rights, while the other half belonged to various other parties, including Cameron's production partners. This shared ownership arrangement worked fine for the first film, but it created a serious roadblock when it came time to develop a sequel because Hemdale Film Corporation had absolutely no interest in making another Terminator movie. Hemdale's refusal to greenlight a sequel meant that no one could legally proceed with production, since any new Terminator film would require the consent of both ownership parties. James Cameron found himself in the frustrating position of having a successful franchise and eager studio partners, but being completely unable to move forward because one of the rights holders simply didn't want to participate in making more movies. The situation remained stuck for several years until Hemdale Film Corporation began experiencing severe financial difficulties in the late 1980s. As the company struggled with mounting debts and cash flow problems, they became much more willing to consider selling their stake in properties that they had previously been determined to hold on to. Recognizing this opportunity, Carolco Pictures approached Hemdale with an offer to purchase their 50% share of the Terminator rights for $5 million. While this might seem like a relatively small amount of money for such a valuable franchise, it represented a significant cash infusion for the financially troubled Hemdale, and they agreed to the deal in 1990. Once Carolco Pictures owned the complete rights to the Terminator franchise, they immediately greenlit the sequel and gave James Cameron the resources he needed to create the ambitious follow-up he had been envisioning. The $5 million purchase price proved to be one of the best investments in Hollywood history, since Terminator 2 went on to gross over $500 million worldwide, and became one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. Fact 9. KY jelly made the Terminator look inhuman. Creating the visual appearance of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator character required the makeup team to solve a subtle but important challenge: how to make one of the most recognizable human faces in Hollywood look slightly artificial, without making the effect obvious to audiences. The T-800 Terminator was supposed to be a cyborg with living tissue over a metal endoskeleton, so the makeup artists needed to find a way to give Schwarzenegger's skin a barely perceptible synthetic quality that would set him apart from the human characters. Makeup artist Jeff Dawn, who worked on Terminator 2, developed an ingenious solution that involved mixing an unexpected ingredient into Arnold's regular foundation makeup. Dawn discovered that by adding a small amount of KY jelly personal lubricant into the standard makeup base, he could create a subtle but effective visual difference that made Schwarzenegger's skin appear slightly more artificial than normal human skin. The KY jelly gave Arnold's makeup a very slight plastic-like sheen that wasn't obvious enough for audiences to consciously notice, but created a subconscious impression that something was different about his appearance. Dawn described the effect as giving Schwarzenegger a plastic man appearance that made viewers feel like he looked different from the other actors without being able to identify exactly what was unusual about his face. This technique was particularly important because the Terminator character needed to be believable as both a machine and a convincing human infiltrator. If the makeup had been too obvious or artificial looking, it would have made the character seem fake rather than advanced. But if Arnold had looked completely normal, audiences wouldn't have gotten the subtle visual cue that he was playing something other than a regular human being. The KY jelly mixture had to be applied carefully to achieve the right balance, since too much would have made the effect noticeable and distracting, while too little wouldn't have created any visual difference at all. The makeup team spent considerable time experimenting with the exact proportions to find the perfect combination that would give Arnold the slightly unnatural appearance they were looking for. This creative use of an everyday product became one of many practical effects techniques that helped make the Terminator character memorable and distinctive, proving that sometimes the most effective movie magic comes from simple, inexpensive solutions rather than expensive high-tech equipment. Fact 10. James Cameron filmed the helicopter stunt himself. One of the most breathtaking and dangerous stunts in Terminator 2 involves a Bell Jet Ranger helicopter flying at high speed directly under a freeway overpass during the chase sequence, and this incredibly risky maneuver was so hazardous that the professional camera crew assigned to film it refused to participate in the shoot. The stunt required veteran pilot Charles A. Tamburo to navigate the helicopter through an extremely narrow space with only inches of clearance on all sides, creating a situation where even the smallest mistake could result in a catastrophic crash. The helicopter stunt was meticulously planned to ensure it could be executed safely, with the production team taking precise measurements to confirm that the aircraft would have just enough clearance to pass under the overpass without hitting the concrete structure. Tamburo had to maintain exactly the right speed to avoid ground effect, which occurs when a helicopter's rotor blades create airflow patterns that can interfere with the aircraft's stability when flying too close to surfaces. When it came time to film this dangerous sequence, the original camera crew took one look at the setup and decided that the risk was simply too great for them to participate. The crew members were concerned about their safety and refused to position themselves near the stunt, citing the very real possibility that something could go wrong and put everyone in the area at serious risk. Rather than abandoning the stunt or trying to find a replacement camera crew willing to take the risk, James Cameron made the decision to operate the camera equipment himself. The director personally took control of the filming process, positioning himself close enough to the action to capture the dramatic footage he needed for the movie. Cameron's hands-on approach to this dangerous stunt was typical of his filmmaking style, as he was known for pushing boundaries and refusing to compromise his vision, even when faced with significant safety concerns. The helicopter sequence required two different camera angles, one from behind the aircraft and another from in front, which meant that Tamburo had to perform this incredibly risky maneuver twice to get all the footage that Cameron needed. The pilot later said that if he had made even the smallest error during either attempt, the consequences would have been fatal, stating, "If I made a mistake, I would be killed." The successful completion of this stunt resulted in one of the most memorable and technically impressive sequences in action cinema history. Fact 11. Robert Patrick could catch up to motorcycles. When Robert Patrick was cast as the T-1000 in Terminator 2, He understood that the role would require him to portray an advanced killing machine that could run at superhuman speeds without showing any signs of fatigue or breathlessness. To prepare for this physically demanding character, Patrick embarked on one of the most intense training regimens ever undertaken by an actor for a movie role, and the results of his preparation were so impressive that they actually created problems during filming. Patrick's training routine involved running 4 times per day, every single day, focusing not just on building speed and endurance, but also on learning how to maintain perfect breathing control while sprinting at full capacity. He practiced breathing exclusively through his nose during these intense running sessions, which allowed him to appear completely calm and machine-like, even while moving at high speeds. This breathing technique was crucial for creating the unsettling effect of a Terminator that could pursue its targets relentlessly without ever showing signs of exhaustion. The most dramatic demonstration of Patrick's incredible conditioning came during the filming of the famous chase sequence where the T-1000 pursues John Connor through the streets and drainage channels of Los Angeles. In this scene, Edward Furlong's character escapes on a dirt bike while the T-1000 chases him on foot, and the sequence was designed to show the relentless pursuit capabilities of the liquid metal Terminator. However, when they began filming the chase scenes, Patrick's physical conditioning proved to be almost too effective for the movie's needs. During the very first take of the sequence, Patrick ran so fast that he actually caught up to Edward Furlong on his dirt bike and was able to reach out and tap the young actor on the shoulder. The stunt coordinator and insert car driver who was towing Furlong's bike had been warned that Patrick was an exceptional runner, but they confidently assured the production team that there was no way a man on foot could keep pace with a motorcycle. This unexpected development forced the filmmakers to make adjustments to their shooting plans, as they had to ask Patrick to deliberately slow down his running pace so that the chase scene would look believable on camera. The production team joked that if the T-1000's pursuit capabilities were real, humanity would be in serious trouble, since Patrick had demonstrated that an advanced Terminator could indeed catch motorized vehicles under the right circumstances. Fact 12. The minigun was too heavy for anyone but Arnold. One of the most iconic weapons in Terminator 2 is the massive handheld Mo-134 minigun that Arnold Schwarzenegger's character uses during the assault on the Cyberdyne Systems building, and this fearsome piece of military hardware created unique challenges for the production team due to its extraordinary weight and size. The weapon that appears in the movie was actually the same customized minigun that had been used in Arnold's previous film Predator, but it had been modified specifically for Terminator 2 with new grips and mounting systems that made it even more difficult to handle. Originally, James Cameron had planned for the Terminator to use a much smaller Mach-10 submachine gun during the Cyberdyne sequence, but shortly before filming began, he decided to revisit the impressive minigun from Predator and rewrite the scene as a much more dramatic and devastating shootout. The weapon required significant modifications to make it suitable for handheld use, including the removal of the original M64 grip assembly and the addition of a chainsaw-style grip that was mounted directly onto the gun's Y-frame support structure. These modifications created a serious practical problem because the new grip configuration meant that the minigun lost its original sling attachment points, forcing whoever operated the weapon to carry its entire weight in their hands and arms. The minigun itself was incredibly heavy even before adding the additional equipment needed to make it function, including the duffel bag full of ammunition and the battery packs required to power the gun's rotating barrels. According to reports from the set, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the only person among the cast and crew who possessed the physical strength necessary to actually lift and operate this modified minigun effectively. While some sources suggest that director James Cameron was also able to handle the weapon, as evidenced by behind-the-scenes footage of him testing it while saying, "Arnold's gonna love this," Schwarzenegger's exceptional physical conditioning from his bodybuilding career made him uniquely suited to wielding such a massive piece of equipment for extended periods during filming. The weight of the minigun was so substantial that cables running from the weapon into the duffel bag were necessary, not just for ammunition feed, but possibly also to help support some of the gun's weight or to connect to off-camera power supplies. This practical limitation meant that the casting of Schwarzenegger wasn't just about his acting ability or screen presence, but also about his literal physical capability to handle the enormous weapons that the Terminator character required. Fact 13. Dog food created T-1000 1000 steel-passing sound. One of the most unsettling and memorable sound effects in Terminator 2 occurs when the liquid metal T-1000 demonstrates its ability to pass through solid steel barriers, such as the bars of John Connor's foster father's garage, or the metal structures throughout the film. The eerie, viscous sound that accompanies these scenes perfectly captures the unsettling nature of a being that can flow through seemingly impenetrable obstacles, but the method used to create this iconic audio effect was surprisingly simple and incredibly inexpensive. Sound designer Gary Rydstrom, who was responsible for creating the T-1000's various audio signatures, needed to find a way to represent the sound of liquid metal slowly moving through solid steel. The challenge was creating something that would sound both organic and mechanical, suggesting a substance that was neither fully liquid nor completely solid, but something unnaturally in between. Rydstrom's solution came from an everyday household item that cost the production team virtually nothing to acquire. He discovered that the sound of dog food being slowly sucked out of a sealed can create exactly the kind of viscous, unsettling noise that he needed for the T-1000's steel-passing sequences. The suction sound produced by the wet dog food being drawn out of its container had the perfect combination of organic squishiness and mechanical precision that matched the visual of liquid metal flowing through barriers. The process involved carefully controlling the speed at which the dog food was extracted from the can to create different variations of the sound effect. By manipulating how quickly or slowly the suction occurred, Rydstrom could create audio that matched the specific pacing of each scene, where the T-1000 passed through steel structures. The technique was so effective that it became one of the most recognizable sound signatures associated with the character. Rydstrom was particularly proud of this creative solution because it demonstrated that effective sound design didn't require expensive equipment or complex recording setups. The entire sound effect cost the production exactly 75 cents, which was the price of a single can of dog food from a local grocery store. This incredibly economical approach to creating movie magic became one of Rydstrom's favorite examples of how simple, everyday materials could be used to create otherworldly effects that would enhance the storytelling and contribute to the film's lasting impact on audiences. Fact 14. Studio executives tried to cut the opening scene. As production on Terminator 2 progressed throughout 1990 and 1991, the film's budget began spiraling far beyond its original estimates, climbing from an initial $75 million to over $88 million, making it the most expensive movie ever produced at that time. This dramatic cost increase made the executives at Coralco Pictures extremely nervous about their investment, and they began looking for ways to reduce expenses by cutting scenes from the film that they considered non-essential to the basic storyline. One of the sequences that the studio executives identified as a potential target for elimination was the iconic biker bar scene that introduces Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator character to audiences. In this memorable opening sequence, the T-800 arrives from the future, walks naked into a rough biker establishment called the Corral, and proceeds to acquire clothing, boots, and a motorcycle from the intimidating patrons through a combination of physical dominance and mechanical precision. From the studio's perspective, this scene might have seemed like an expensive luxury that could be removed without affecting the main plot, since it primarily served to establish the Terminator's character and provide some humor and spectacle, rather than advancing the central story of protecting John Connor. The executives calculated that cutting the biker bar sequence could save a significant amount of money and help bring the ballooning budget back under control. However, the Coralco executives knew they couldn't simply order James Cameron to remove the scene, since the director was notoriously protective of his creative vision and unlikely to agree to major cuts without a fight. Instead, they approached Arnold Schwarzenegger and asked him to use his influence with Cameron to convince the director that the biker bar scene should be eliminated from the final film. Schwarzenegger listened to the studio executives' proposal, but refused to support their request to cut the scene. When pressed to intervene on behalf of the studio, Arnold delivered what became a legendary response among the cast and crew. Only a studio guy would cut out a scene like that. His refusal to pressure Cameron meant that the executives had no choice but to accept the scene as part of the film, and the biker bar introduction remained intact, becoming one of the most memorable and frequently quoted sequences in the entire movie. Fact 15. Theatrical prints arrived the night before release. The groundbreaking visual effects work in Terminator 2. Judgment Day pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible in 1991, But this ambitious approach to filmmaking created a logistical nightmare that brought the production dangerously close to missing its scheduled release date. The film's complex combination of computer-generated imagery, practical effects, and traditional optical compositing required an unprecedented amount of time to complete, and the post-production timeline stretched far longer than anyone had anticipated when the July 3, 1991 release date was originally announced. James Cameron and his team at Industrial Light and Magic were pioneering techniques that had never been attempted before, particularly the creation of the liquid metal T-1000 character through computer graphics. The process of rendering each frame of CGI was incredibly time-consuming with the technology available at that time, and the team discovered that their initial estimates for completing the visual effects work had been far too optimistic. As the planned release date approached, it became clear that the post-production schedule was in serious trouble. The visual effects teams were working around the clock to finish the complicated sequences that required multiple layers of effects work, including scenes that combined miniature photography, optical compositing, computer graphics, and live-action footage. Each of these elements had to be perfectly synchronized and color-corrected before the final film prints could be created. The situation became so desperate that Carolco Pictures and the distribution teams began making contingency plans for potentially delaying the release, which would have been a catastrophic financial blow given the massive marketing campaign that had already been launched and the theater bookings that were in place for the lucrative Independence Day weekend opening. In a dramatic race against time, the final visual effects shots were completed, and the film was rushed through the printing process just hours before theaters needed to receive their copies. Movie theater managers across the country found themselves in the unprecedented situation of receiving their film prints on the night of July 2nd, less than 24 hours before the first scheduled screenings were supposed to begin. This incredibly tight timeline meant that theater projectionists had virtually no time to preview the film or test their equipment with the actual prints before audiences began arriving for the first showings. The last-minute delivery became legendary in the film industry as an example of how ambitious filmmaking could push production schedules to their absolute breaking point.